YouTube, how's it going? My name is Kevin, also known as Phoenix, and today we're going to be going over my tier list for the modern metagame. Now before we begin this video, I do have a few disclaimers that I want to go over really quickly. Now the first disclaimer is that just because a deck is in the upper tier, doesn't mean that it can't be beaten by a lower tier deck. These are generally just the general strengths of the decks compared to the modern metagame. My next disclaimer is that every deck on this list is capable of winning an event, so just because it seems a little low on the list doesn't mean it isn't a viable option. And finally, decks within the same tiers are not organized. I generally don't see the purpose in organizing like this one is slightly better than the other one when we're doing a tier list, because the general purpose of it is that these are within the same tier, these are generally around the same level. Now there are a lot of decks in this list because I wanted to make sure that I covered a lot of options, so I won't be able to have the time to go over specific cards or what the deck generally does all too much, so it'll be pretty brief. Now that we've gotten all the formalities out of the way, let's jump into the tier list. So for our first tier, we have the don't play tier. Now you're more than welcome to play any of these decks. As I said, they're all viable. These are just generally what I would not play in an event. And to start us off, we have Living End. Now Living End is a combo deck that looks to cycle a bunch of creatures into the graveyard and then bring them back with the card Living End. And of course you're going to be casting Living End for free based off of a Cascade spell. Now this deck has explosive board states, it can combo on its opponent's turn, it can protect it with cards like Force of Negation. However, this deck tends to folly a little bit when it comes to board wipes, and also if you don't have the Force of Negation protection, then all it takes is a counter spell to kind of undo the progress. Not to mention this deck doesn't really fight through graveyard hate all that well, so there definitely are some flaws, and it's kind of easy to fight through this deck as long as your deck is prepared for any amount of graveyard synergy. Up next, we have the Stoneblade decks. Now the Stoneblade decks that I'm referring to are more or less the Orzhov Stoneblade decks, the decks that look to utilize Grief and Ephemerate to empty your opponent's hand and then win the top deck worth by casting a Stoneforge Mystic to get a Kaldra Complete or a Batterskull or whatever the case may be. Now the problem with these decks is that they need 4 cards in your opening hand to get like the best hand combo, which is going to be any black card, Grief, Ephemerate, and Stoneforge Mystic. So you need those 4 cards to really be able to pop off, plus the lands to play them. So it's a little clunky for getting the best hand scenario because you can't mulligan to it. Not to mention that the deck is very reliant on Stoneforge Mystic, so if you cast Stoneforge, you get your Kaldra Complete, and your opponent just kills the Stoneforge, you're kind of just sitting there with a Kaldra Complete in your hand. You're not really able to do anything. So the deck doesn't really grind all that super well, and if you interact with the deck in any way, shape, or form to where it disrupts the game plan, then it really can just dirtle a little bit, so that's why I have it in the don't play tier. Next up, we have Affinity. Of course, some of us know Affinity, but for those of you that don't, Affinity has some of the most explosive starts in the game where you're just able to dump your entire hand onto the battlefield. With cards like Cranial Plating, you're able to put a fast clock because of all the artifacts that you have. And with the Printing of Urza Saga, you're able to search for more artifacts, and you're able to make construct tokens that just work off of artifacts. So this deck does have a very explosive start. However, it is an all artifact deck, so any amount of artifact hate in your opponent's sideboard is definitely going to be paying its dividends. Plus the deck is a little weak to board wipes. If your opponent can just keep the board clean, then the deck doesn't really do all that much. Next up, there is Mill. Now Mill is honestly the gotcha deck of the format, because if you're not prepared for it and you're not running a graveyard deck, then you kind of just get milled. This deck has some amazing, very efficient cards in Modern, and with the printing of recent cards like Tasha's Hideous Laughter, it's really good against low CMC decks, which Modern tends to have a ton of decks that run low CMC stuff. But on the other hand, the deck does fall to a single Emrakul or Kozilek in the sideboard, and again, if your opponent's running a graveyard deck, you're kind of just helping them out, so definitely in my don't play list. And as much as it pains me, the final deck in the don't play tier is going to be Amulet Titan. Now Amulet Titan is a good lands combo deck if that's what you're trying to play. It can win games through combat damage with Primeval Titan, or it could just win through Valakut triggers. But it does happen to get hosed down by some sideboard cards like Alpine Moon, And not to mention that there's lots of good removal for cards like Dryad and Primeval Titan. But on the other hand, the printing of Urza Saga does make Amulet of Vigor a little bit more consistent. So overall, I think the deck is just a little too slow for the meta right now, but definitely keep an eye out for it. Okay, now we can move to the viable tier, and the viable tier is basically what it sounds like. These decks aren't the best, they're not the worst, they're viable. And to start off, we have Etron. Now, Etron has always been considered for a long time to be the best Chalice deck, and Chalice of the Void is good right now, so that's one of the pluses that it has going for it. It's a good mid-range deck that has some game against the control decks through the use of Cavern of Souls. But on the other hand, it also doesn't get Tron consistently, and if this deck doesn't get Tron, it tends to be a little too slow. And there's not much grind potential compared to the other decks because it's a colorless deck. There's not really many cards that just get you card advantage. Next up, we have the Rakdos/Mardu Lurrus midrange decks. Now, these decks are honestly very good at grinding with Lurrus, and they also have multiple game-ending threats such as Kroxa and DRC and Ragavan. However, the deck is very reliant on the graveyard, so Rest in Peace does pull its weight here. And the deck is honestly very over-reliant on Lurrus because if you just take out the Lurrus, the deck doesn't have too much going on for it other than buying back a Kroxa. So again, a lot of these cards just revolve around the graveyard, so if you can manage to deal with that, the deck does fall. Next we have the Yorion decks. Now I'm talking about the 5-color all the way to the blank versions because honestly they generally follow the same game plan of what they're trying to do, and that is getting value. Now there's a high ceiling when it comes to the value for these decks. Many of these cards have draw a card just tagged on to already good effects, and 5-color good stuff usually just has answers for just about anything. However, I will die on the hill that running 80 cards is just so much more inconsistent than running 60 cards, and the deck can be very slow because of this. So it's viable, not necessarily my favorite type of deck, but it's viable. And the next deck might honestly get me some hate, but I'm gonna have to put Esper Reanimator in this spot because Archon is a very powerful card that can win the game if left unchecked, and the deck only does require 2 cards to combo, which is a lot better than the 4 cards that I was talking about when it came to Orzhov Stoneblade. However, this deck is super graveyard dependent. Like, if there is no graveyards, then you can't really reanimate anything. And the Archon doesn't win on ETB, and by that I mean I've had opponents successfully get an Archon onto the field, did the effect, just terminate the Archon, and then just win the game from there. So the deck, if left unchecked, can win, but it feels like any amount of meaningful interaction can definitely slow down, if not just outright blow out the deck completely. And the final deck that we have in the viable tier is just going to be good old mono green Tron. Now the deck has very good mulligans where it can just go all the way down to 3 as long as it can get that Tron land combo, which it consistently can do when you utilize the mulligans to its fullest. It does go over the top for most of the mid-range decks that are out there right now, and it has the ability to fight through the enchantment land hate. However, it can be a little slow if you do not get the turn 3 Tron, and it's also a little weak to control decks as it doesn't have a good way to consistently play this can't be countered spells. So I would put it in viable, definitely not to be slept on, but viable. Now we are in the good choice tier. Now the good choice tier is basically my personal favorites of this is a good deck, you should be running it, and you will see success in it. Now to start off this tier, we have Elementals, which is just a very strong, good mid-range tribal deck that has removal, it has ramp, and it has card advantage in the form of creatures. Not to mention it's an Omnath deck which pairs really well with Risen Reef, but it's also going to introduce landfall into the swing of things. However, the deck does get shut down by cards such as Torpor Orb, which it does have ways to fight through it, but if it can't find those ways, then the deck just plays a bunch of vanilla creatures. Next up, we have good old classical Burn. With all these mid-range and late game decks running around, Burn can really take advantage of its speed to close out games quickly. The major weakness I would say with Burn is that it can sometimes run out of gas, and it doesn't play well against cards such as Chalice of the Void, which are starting to see an increase in play, so there are some give and takes here. And to close off this tier, we have the Murktide Regent decks. Now, I've seen Izzet and Jeskai, so I'm just going to call them the Murktide decks. And they're just a good tempo deck with a very fast clock. Just putting down a big dragon on turn 3 that can potentially even be an 8/8 is massive. And honestly, this deck does dodge a lot of the low CMC removals such as Lightning Bolt and Unholy Heat and Prismatic Ending, because Murktide Regent just gets too big and the CMC is too high. Now, the deck is weak to Graveyard Hake, as it does need to utilize that delve mechanic, and one of the backup game ending threats is DRC. So if you just hate on the graveyard, again, it tends to slow down this deck quite a bit. And we finally made it to the best decks tier. Now, to start it off, we're going to just talk about control. I think this deck is super good right now that the format's kind of settled and the control players have finally figured out what 75 they want to play. With all these mid-range decks running around, this deck really just looks to go over them and control the battlefield in a meaningful way. There are tons of new game-ending tools such as Shark Typhoon and Hall the Storm Giant, plenty of counterspells and removal for the mid-range decks, as I've said. But the deck can be a little slow, and sometimes it does struggle to find the answer that it needs right then and there. Sometimes the problem isn't necessarily that it doesn't have the answer, it just needs to find it. Of course, I can't talk about best decks without talking about Hammer Time. This is probably the fastest, most consistent aggro deck that is also a combo deck in the format. So of course it has the potential for a turn 2 win, multiple ways to search for combo pieces through Urza Saga, Stoneforge Mystic, and the Seal Shaper gift. The deck just has so much going on for it. It's very resilient, can struggle to some artifact hate, but also has ways to fight through it as well. And while I was down on this deck before, I do have to say I've been made a believer that Temur Rhinos is one of the best decks you can be playing right now. It's just a solid mid-range deck that really can put up a fast clock in the form of Rhinos and interact with the board state in a meaningful way. Has main deck ways of fighting through Cascade Hate and also can combo on your opponent's turn. However, it does struggle a little bit to perform when the deck can't go bigger than 4/4 Rhinos, so if you're going up against a deck that looks to go bigger than you, sometimes you do falter a little bit, but again, super fast clock and very good deck. And to end the best deck tier, we have good old Zoomer Jund. Now, this new version of Jund really pushes Urza Saga to the limits through the use of Wrenn and 6, just being able to loop it over and over again. The deck is a grind machine. Now, I will say there are no good ways to really kind of single-handedly sideboard against this deck because it's doing so much. It has a good creature plan, it has a good Urza Saga fetch target plan, it has a good looping cards out of the graveyard with Wrenn and 6, so it almost feels like you have to bring in multiple different strategies. So it can be hard to sideboard against this deck, but the deck is a little slow to start up, but once it does get started up, man, does this deck go. And to finally end the tier list, we have the Phoenix deck of choice, which honestly could change in a few weeks because there are so many decks that I'm really enjoying right now. But for now, it's going to have to be Grixis Shadow, which if I had to place it in this tier list, it would be under good choice. Now, the deck has solid threats and is able to protect them through counter magic. Dress Down is one heck of a card. It just makes your 1/1 into a 13/13. So many ways to use this both offensively and defensively, and the fact that it cycles itself just a little bit more to add on how great this card is. Not to mention that Expressive Iteration helps the deck dig and find the answer that it needs. Sometimes there's a little bit of inconsistency with it, but overall I've been really enjoying this deck, so that would be my deck of choice. And that's my tier list for the modern metagame. If you want to see a deck review on any of these decks, or if I didn't go over a deck that you were hoping that I was going to talk about, just let me know in the comments down below. Of course, like and subscribe as well to see more content and just help out the channel. It really does mean a lot to me, and I will see you all next time.